In the last video, we looked at how economic growth, or an increase in potential GDP, so not just economic growth, but sustainable economic growth, an increase in potential GDP comes from one of four sources: increasing natural resources, increasing your real capital, increasing your technology, or increasing your quantity and your quality of labor. And we said that the quantity and quality of labor is the primary source for sustainable economic growth in Canada. So let's look at how can we increase the quantity and quality of labor in our country. Well, there's really three ways you can increase the quantity and quality of your labor. The first is we increase the quantity of our labor by increasing the population. If we have more people in our country, then that should mean more workers, which means we're making more goods and services. Economic growth. Now, this doesn't necessarily guarantee economic growth because your population could increase without your workforce increasing. So, for example, if we brought in a bunch of foreigners that were everyone's grandparents from all their homelands, then if those people aren't working, then they're not necessarily adding to the production within a country. Or if we all had tons of babies, well, when everyone's young, when they're kids, those children are increasing the population, but not adding to the workforce, so not adding to the goods and services. So increases in population can increase the number of workers and therefore create economic growth, but not necessarily. The other challenge we have when it comes to increasing the population is when that population increases, it's possible that because they're not adding more to production, it actually hurts our economic growth. Which brings us to a theory created by Thomas Malthus. So Thomas Malthus was an Anglican clergyman. So Reverend Thomas Malthus. In 1798, so this is in England, in 1798, Thomas Malthus had this theory about economic growth. And according to Thomas Malthus, we are never going to get that sustained economic growth because what keeps happening is that whenever the population increases, that means we have more mouths to feed, and the population is growing much faster than our food supply. And so what he was looking at is essentially what has become the predator-prey model that we see today in science. The idea is that as your population grows, so population goes up, as the population increases, that means there's more mouths to feed, and at some point, there's going to be more mouths to feed than there is food to provide for. And so what happens is that there's not enough food for everyone, so then the population is going to fall. And as the population falls, well, now there's more food for everybody, so people live longer, they have more children, and then the population starts to go up again. But then at some point, the population exceeds the food supply, and then it starts to fall again. So, according to Thomas Malthus, we're never going to get economic growth. And we're never going to get economic growth because if you look at over time, the food supply that we have grows arithmetically. The idea here is that each additional farmer's field is added one field at a time. So we're adding another field, then another field. So it's adding. Food grows arithmetically. So on a graph, that would be a straight line. Over time, we add another field, another field, another field. But the problem is that the population, it multiplies, right? We have babies, our babies have babies, and so the population grows geometrically. And so on a graph, the population looks like this over time. So at some point, the population is going to be more than the food supply, which puts us back into this model of then the population falls, and then as we have enough food for each person, the population starts to climb, and we go back to this cycle. So because of this, we can never really have economic growth. And this idea is what created, or because of this, economics has gotten known as the dismal science, right? It's sad and depressing because we're never going to be able to get this sustainable growth. Well, what was Thomas Malthus' solution to this? Well, it was quite a scandal back in 1798, especially from someone from the Anglican Church. But his solution was, one, we should raise the death rate. Now, he's not saying that we should kill people. What he's saying is that when that population gets up above that food supply, then there's going to be hunger, there's going to be famine, there's going to be war over the shortage of food. And he says, let people die. Don't try to save them, let people die. If you let people die from hunger, from famine, from disease, from war, then the population will fall, and then those who do survive, there will be enough for everybody else. The other thing he said is that we should lower the birth rate. We should have birth control. We should have abstinence. Have people have less children, because if they have less children, there's less mouths to feed, and then those who are living will each have more of the food supply. So his solution was to raise the death rate, lower the birth rate, because as long as we have less people, then there will be more to go around. From his view, it was impossible to really ever see economic growth. Well, where does that put us today? Are we still in this cycle, or what is called the Malthusian trap? We can see this Malthusian trap all the way up in time until the Industrial Revolution. So what changed with the Industrial Revolution? Well, the Industrial Revolution, people moved from the farms to cities and worked in factories. So this was the first time in history that a single worker was actually making more than their family consumed. Because of that increase in productivity, workers now made more than they needed in terms of goods and services, which means everyone got access to more goods and services. So then we started to see economic growth. So that begs the question, this Malthusian trap, will we ever be back there? Well, right now it's estimated that the world can handle about 10 billion people. Okay, we're currently at about 7 billion. Now that's assuming that we all keep the same diets that we currently have. So we continue to eat meat. Well, it's projected that we're going to hit 11 billion in 2100. So if the world can only handle 10 billion, we're going to hit that within the next 100 years. And so at that point, if there's then not enough food for the people, we're back to the Malthusian trap unless we can find a way to further increase our productivity so that there is more goods and services per person. All right, so let's go back to our list. How do we increase the quantity and quality of labor? Well, the first was increase the population, assuming that the population you're increasing is adding to the production of goods and services, and that those workers are producing more than they are consuming so that we're not stuck in this Malthusian trap. Which brings us to number 2, increasing labor productivity. So we really need to get more from each worker in order to get that sustainable economic growth. So how can we increase labor productivity? Well, when we look at labor productivity, we're looking at what's the value that a typical worker makes. And on this graph, what you see is a comparison to the US. So consider this 0 here, the US as a benchmark. And then you can see our comparison of productivity between Canada and the US, and we can also look at the UK compared to the US. So Canada in red, UK in black. So notice that in terms of productivity, Canadians are less productive than they are in the US. And the UK is less productive than the US, Canada being even less productive. Well, where might this be coming from? Well, when we break it down, we can look at hours worked. So people in the UK work less hours than Canadians and the US. We can look at the unemployment rate. At the time that this graph was built, the unemployment rate was higher in the US than it was in Canada or the UK. We can look at labor force participation rate. So what percentage of workers who can work, what percentage of them do work? So there are people who are of working age who choose not to work. Maybe they're a stay-at-home parent, maybe they're independently wealthy and don't have to. So we have people who are able to work but don't. So we can look at the labor force participation rate. The labor force participation rate is higher in Canada than it is in the UK or in the US. We can also look at demographics. That is the age of our population. So the older the population, the less productive, right? Because more people retire. And we can see when we look at this here that when it comes to our demographic structure, that we have a younger population than they do in the US, and the UK has an older population than both Canada and the US. We can look more at labor productivity. Here you can see the value of what the typical Canadian makes. So the typical Canadian, if we're looking at, this is all in US dollars so we can compare across. The typical Canadian in 2012 was making about $47.30 worth of goods in an hour. Now, if we compare that to what the typical Canadian actually makes in an hour, that's more than twice what the typical Canadian makes in an hour. So we're making more than we're getting paid, we're making more than we consume. In the United States, a typical worker makes about $64 worth of goods in an hour. In Mexico, it's just under $20. So it seems that the US is adding more value, making more goods per worker per hour than we are in Canada, and Mexico less so. If we look at what's been happening to Canada over time, here's our labor productivity, and notice this has been really flat. In fact, the International Monetary Fund, the Bank of Canada, a number of organizations have warned that the biggest risk to economic growth in Canada is the fact that our productivity has not been increasing. It's been fairly flat for decades. Well, how come the US is more productive per worker than they are in Canada? And how come Mexico is less so? Well, the United States invests more in capital goods, which means more machines. And so the typical worker, because they are manning or they're looking after multiple machines that are doing a lot of the work, that means the typical worker is making more goods than the typical Canadian worker, who's doing more labor-intensive, less mechanized work. In Mexico, it's even further that way in terms of more work by hand, and so less mechanization, and then that is why the productivity is lower. The other thing you have to look at is what is the countries producing. Countries that produced finished goods are more productive because there's more value added in that finished product than in countries that produce raw materials. So countries that produce raw materials, there's less value added, meaning that the difference between what they are using as their inputs, their materials to make their product, and what they are selling, there's less difference in the value of that because they're taking a raw material and just still turning it into a material that's used in something else, versus in countries where you make finished products, and you're taking raw materials and turning them into a finished good, there's more value added to that. So it's worth more, and so what each additional worker makes has a greater value. So countries with higher productivity per worker tend to make finished goods, and countries that have lower productivity per worker tend to be making more raw materials where there's less value added. All right, so let's go back to our list here. Oh, of course, we're having technical difficulties at the moment. See if we can get this to reappear. So when we look at the quantity and quality of labor, we talked about how increasing the population will give us a better quantity of labor. We talked about how increasing labor productivity will increase the quality of our labor because we'll get more from them. And then the third one is a change in human capital. So let's see if we can't get that slide to appear properly now. So increase the population, increase labor productivity, and the third one we want to look at is an increase in human capital. So recall what human capital is. Human capital is anything that increases the quality of your workers. So when we talk about human capital, we are talking about work experience, education. The more knowledgeable your workforce, the more productive they become, and the more they will add to production and economic growth. So it's accumulated skills and knowledge that our workers have. Well, we can look at human capital. And earlier this semester, in a different level, we looked at how our human capital has been increasing over time, right? More of us are getting higher education than in previous generations. Here, you can see by country an investment in human capital. For example, we can measure that based on literacy, the ability to read. Notice that countries that have a higher literacy rate have a higher real GDP per capita. Countries with lower literacy, so less human capital, less education, work experience, training, will lead to a smaller real GDP per capita. So we can get economic growth by increasing the human capital in our population.